Okay, we will begin. Appreciate all the board members being here, and I want to start by introducing three new board members that we have. We're delighted with their presence. We've had them involved in morning discussion here and so forth, got them up to full running speed. They're on track, ready to go. First is Wendy Tucker. Wendy is right here. Wendy, we're certainly pleased to have you as a member of the board. Next to her, Lillian Hargrove. Lillian, pleased to have you. And Cato Johnson. Cato, we were pleased to have these new board members. And I believe we've got enough on our plate, agenda, and so forth that we can keep them as well as all the current board members pretty busy for the next several years here. You'll notice our new surroundings here. This is just in honor of our new board members. We've upgraded our facilities for this workshop, and we should have gotten you on board earlier so we could have had these nice facilities, but we appreciate you being here, bringing on the board. Look forward to some good workshop material here for today, and then got some important, really important agenda items for the board meeting tomorrow, an extensive agenda there. The first item that we've got on the agenda for the workshop here this afternoon is the price of textbooks, paper versus electronic. It's been something that we've debated back and forth some, and who's Randy going to make that presentation? Randy Colligan? Okay.
Thank you all for having me today.
Make sure to turn your mic on.
Okay, I think, is she on? Okay, I am Randy Collian. I'm with Tennessee Book Company. We are the state textbook depository. We represent the publishers that have adopted material in Tennessee and do the distribution and the customer support to the local districts across Tennessee. My expertise is in the field of working directly with the publishers. We understand their formats. We understand what kind of materials they're presenting. We understand what type of materials, not only that they're bringing into Tennessee, but also what they're bringing across other states in the United States. Please keep in mind when I talk about pricing, this is information that I've gathered from the market and directly from conversations with various K-12 publishers. We, as Tennessee Book Company, the State Textbook Depository, has nothing to do with setting pricing. To start off, I just wanted to kind of outline the various formats that are being offered in K-12, as well as this is probably being offered in collegiate markets also. But the main format that's been offered and probably been offered when we were all in the classroom is the print or the basic textbook. There's nothing different than what we had other than probably the size and weight, which is another discussion that I don't want to get into. But the print textbook is still available, still used widely across the state and across the United States. The second version or format is the digital textbook. And when I say digital, I mean completely digital, nothing tangible being delivered into the classroom. So it has to come through a device, whether it's a mobile device like your iPhone or Samsung or whatever, an iPad, a tablet, a laptop, nothing in print. Couple of things with the digital content that is available. Initially, digital content, which was probably 10 to 15 years ago, was available, but it was strictly paper under glass. Meaning you didn't carry the book, but you could pull your monitor up and you could read all day long. You couldn't copy, you couldn't paste, you couldn't highlight, you couldn't share. Mainly PDF type formats. The latest and the more progressing digital content is what we call interactive materials. The interactive material is being offered, and it's not just the content. It has live links, videos, YouTube connections, anything to help add supplemental information to the content that's being studied. A lot of this actually has assessments and quizzes. So as you're working through a piece of material, you can stop and do a pop-up quiz to see how great you understand it or how poorly you understand the material. Behind the assessments and quizzes, There's also typically attachments to what we call LMS, learning management systems. A learning management system is typically owned by the district, and it's linked to the schools and to the students. And it's sharing possibly gradebook update information. It's also capturing analytics. And when I say analytics, not details of the student information, but details on what the student is doing on the content, whether they're spending 30 minutes reading page after page, whether they're connecting to the links, whether they're even going into the website. So there's a lot of good information being made available through the interactive materials. Now, let's talk about digital distribution very briefly. The old style of digital textbook distribution is you had a CD, and it came on the inside cover of your textbook. So you got the textbook, you had a CD, you plug it into your laptop or whatever. Now it's more interactive, or internet required. It's typically an online login or password with the capability to download. And again, possibly with the capability to download the material. Some publishers have that content where you can download it so you do not need internet connectivity. Some do not. Pitfalls on download. Very large files, 4 or 5 gigabytes. If you look at some of the smaller devices, you're running 16 to 24 gigabytes, so you can max out pretty quickly if you have multiple subject areas. So now, on the online access, obviously there's device compatibility issues. As some devices work better than others, there's also going to be infrastructure issues based on whether the schools have the DSL speed to support videos being driven down and the various graphics and so forth that are added to these textbooks. The more popular trend in Tennessee and across the U.S., honestly, is the third format, which is the print and digital or the blended learning environment. Publishers are offering the print with the digital access code, and usually the digital access code is a download and an online access, so you can have both worlds. Again, this may vary from publisher to publisher, but the majority of publishers are leaning towards both download and online access. They're getting away from the 15 to 10 year ago CD or the 10 to 15 year ago CD option, but it is available. If you still need the CD type environment, they will work with you. The other thing with the access codes, publishers are it's easier to transfer the access code from student A to student B as they migrate through the system. So obviously your Algebra 1 book, you want to move it to the new Algebra 1 student at the end of the class. And it's very easy to do that because usually it's a school-based login, not an individual login, so they can transfer it down the line. Now, the big reason I'm here, which not sure if this is good news or bad news, pricing. And remember, we do not set pricing, so please don't hate too much. Prices of print textbooks range anywhere from $20, $25, upwards of $125 to $150. This is going to depend on the grade, the subject area, and the publisher itself. We have a lot of college prep AP books being used across the board in Tennessee, and they will be upwards of $100 to $125. The digital prices are not going to vary too far off of print, and I'll explain why here in a couple of seconds. But right now we're seeing both about a 3 to 5% decrease from print and possibly a 3 to 5% increase from print, pending the subject area, pending the publisher. Nothing dramatic. I know my wife reads the Kindle, and she loves the 99-cent books that she'll download through Amazon, where you buy them at $4.99 or $5.99. I have not seen that type of price discounting anywhere in education. And I will even bring up the iBook. The iBook advertises at $14.99. Great deal. It's a one-year access code. So if you're buying in comparison to what our schools buy, which is a book for 6 years, you're looking at $90 by the end of 6 years when you spend $15 over the 6-year cycle. So the discount appears to be there on the front side, but it really, when you compare it with Tennessee and our 6-year cycle, there's not that big of a difference. Again, not pro or con Apple or iBook, just stating the facts that I've gathered and the information that has been shared with me. The print and digital combo. This is, again, the most popular and what we're seeing purchased across Tennessee. It tends to be 5 to 15% above the standard print book because you are actually getting the online access with the print material. It tends, as I said, to be the best option because you have the multiple access points. You can address the weight and size of textbooks by chance. The kids do not necessarily have to carry the book home if they've got online access or any type of library or computer access available near their home. It also allows the districts to migrate or transition towards digital materials. You have the print, you have the digital. As you deem your classrooms ready or your schools ready, you already have your digital access and you can migrate over towards going paperless or printless if you want to, as money is provided or funding is available or the decisions are made. Now, why are prices not dropping on digital? Here's what I've gathered, and again, coming from various publishers and other key players in the market. The majority of the cost of creating a textbook is in the research, development, and editorial portions of creating this content. When a textbook is created, the content needs to align. It needs to align to either the Tennessee standards, the Florida standards, the Texas standards, whoever they're servicing. So each, to prove and to make sure that that material is authentic, there's a lot of headaches and a lot of money invested to make that content worthwhile and roughly help our education system moving forward. The raw materials and printing process averages less than 10% of the price of the book. So you're talking $5 on a $50 book. So as we migrate away from print textbooks, I still don't see the pricing declining that severely. As more and more of the market moves towards digital, there could be some volume issues and there may be some discounting. But right now I have not seen that. Now also I want to express some of the concerns or some of the thoughts that I received from publishers on creating an online textbook or a digital textbook. Creating paper under glass isn't that expensive. Creating interactive material is a lot deeper. The programming and the technical expertise to take assessments so that you can interact with students, to attach and embed videos, to link to the LMS systems, the customer support involved, all rolls into that cost. So that's a cost structure that's not typically there with a print textbook. So that's some of the headaches that they're experiencing and some of the problems that they're trying to overcome and why pricing hasn't moved in the way that maybe the public would like for it to move. With that, I'm going to pause and open the floor, if you don't mind, for questions.
Okay, questions for Randy? I'm surprised Mike has a question on this, but Mike?
So, in regard to the alignment of the curriculum and stuff, how is that different from what the expense they would incur for a hard copy?
You've got a very valid point. I mean, they would need to go through the same alignment, so I'm not sure that that's adding an expense to it, and I may have misstated that or misinterpreted that. I apologize for that. But yes, the alignment would be there whether it was print or digital. But converting it over from the print into a digital format with the links would be the key piece that adds the cost.
Last year when we were approving textbooks, the pricing was there, and it wasn't that that jumped out at me that digital a la Kindle was the same price as hard copies. It was that they were a multiple higher, that it cost prohibitive to go to digital and than the hard copies. And that's the part that I couldn't understand, is what the differential between what and the rest of the world. And I think your R&D argument is an answer. I don't quite I think that is I think that's going to be an expense need to be borne by the company, and not necessarily, they're going to pass it on if they can. But what this ultimately is going to do is open up a whole lot more providers of information in a competitive world. The same publishers are about to find themselves with a whole lot of folks entering into providing text. Yeah.
I have to agree with you, and I think in sitting in some of the or watching some of the Senate and House legislative sessions earlier this year, the goal was to open up and try to bring more content into the state of Tennessee. And you are right, there are more players in the market now. You see, we're seeing a lot of strictly digital content providers. They're coming to the table with nothing in print. It's full interactive, fully being delivered on devices and possibly even multiple devices. So I agree. I think you're exactly right. The other component that I know has always been discussed is open resources, which I think open resources are gradually working their way as supplemental tools. And a lot of the embedded links and videos are allowing for these open resources to be brought into the classroom. The key is making sure that they're vetted and making sure that they align and are teaching what we need taught in the classroom. So I would agree. I think and I have not looked at the new math adoption that's coming up that I think is on the agenda tomorrow, but I think there's some new players on the list that are smaller publishing companies that have moved into the digital world, digital and print possibly, and maybe strictly digital. So I would agree with you, sir, and I think we as a company are trying to adjust and make sure we're there to provide whatever the districts need, digital or print or combination.
Okay, other questions? It sounds to me like what we need to do is get Amazon involved in the textbook process.
That could be a double-edged sword, though, sir. But yes.
Randy, there's some exciting opportunities here. Basically, some of the capabilities that you're describing are really fantastic. Where are we across the state generally in terms of making the transition to some of the interactive type digital content?
Very good question. What I'm seeing is there's pockets across the state that are, I say, dipping their toe in the water. They're running pilot programs. I know Memphis City is looking at 16 schools to do blended learning this year. I know Bristol City and Kingsport City, so you go to opposite ends, are looking at, they have a 3-year plan where they're migrating one-to-one devices into children's hands and developing curriculum around it. So I think you're seeing it all across the state. Metro Nashville is toying with digital opportunities in the new social studies adoption process. So each is working at their speed and their capability as far as whether it's funding, whether it's training, whether it's infrastructure, because some of the backroom support behind the digital is also one of the bigger cost factors, not necessarily in buying the digital. You can buy digital, but then can you support it? Do you have laptops that are going to crash on you? Do you have DSL speed that's going to support 600 students online at one time? A lot of the headaches that some of the private schools have faced by moving that direction, I think districts are learning from that as they communicate back and forth. And I know our assessment program at one time was going to be online, so I think we had districts moving their infrastructure. They focused on digital. They focused on one-to-one or maybe 1-to-4 device, I think is what the target was for testing. So I think districts have moved that way, and content will be the next piece to that. So as a state, and I'll share, I just came from a meeting where I was with 9 other depositories from different states, and we all seem to be facing similar issues. I mean, we're seeing pockets of districts that are testing the water, trying to figure out what's best. But at this time, there are no results that anyone can put their hands on that says digital is superior to print, digital is not superior to print. So the verdict is still out. How does it work? Does it work well? And how do you make it work together, to be honest? Because I think blended is is eventually where we might be, and that's personal opinion.
But from the examples you give and from, I guess, what I hear in personal experience, there are pockets where they're making some progress in that direction, but the majority of the systems throughout the state aren't doing much in this area. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, sir. I think infrastructure's the big drawback right now, or what's holding a lot of them back, is the capital expenditures that they would need to create Wi-Fi in classrooms. I mean, you've got a lot of school buildings that are in areas that just don't support the speed that would be needed to truly have a laptop or a device sitting in front of a student.
Yeah.
So yes.
Okay, other questions? Okay, Randy, we appreciate it. Thank you, thank you. We'll now move to the second item on our agenda, the charter authorizer policy. And Danielle, are you going to introduce that? Yes, Mike? I should have mentioned we've got a new agenda that I don't know what everybody's got, that removes the item that we had there for literacy requirements for teacher preparation program, the Susan Bunch thing. She's not available.
Should be here in October.
Well, good afternoon again. We had a great discussion this morning with the folks at the National Association of Charter School Authorizers just about the nuts and bolts of authorizing as we prepare for our new territory as an appellate authorizer. So we have Elisa Westifer and Katie Peel here who are going to talk to us about our newest policies, which will guide us in our work. So I'll let them take it away.
Wonderful.
You have to push this button.
Thanks. Thank you for having us both here, and we appreciate the time and energy that you spent with us this morning getting acquainted to your new role as a charter authorizer. So as kind of a continuation of that discussion, we wanted to talk about the draft policies that we have developed in coordination with Danelle. And these policies are really the starting point. They're going to set you off on the right foot, and they're going to be kind of the guiding documents that you will use to develop the processes. So we're setting the framework here today. And you are all very familiar with this slide right now, but I think it's important always to kind of take a step back and think about this charter bargain and the premise here, that these schools, if you authorize them, are going to be given greater flexibility and autonomy, and in exchange for that flexibility and autonomy, they are expected to produce outcomes. So turning to the purpose of these policies, you have a new law, so we want to make sure that there are policies in place to help you implement this law. We want to make sure these policies are going to help guide your practice. And your law did include a note, a very important note, that the State Board was going to adopt national authorizing practices. These authorizing practices you will see apparent throughout each policy that we're going to talk about. And again, it's going back to the idea that you have a responsibility to uphold your end of the charter bargain as the authorizing entity. When we think about where did these policies come from, how did we put them together? One of the primary documents that you all have a copy of now are NACSA's Principles and Standards, and I may refer to it throughout the presentation and note page numbers so you can understand where we have really taken our national best practices and what we have learned from working with authorizers throughout the country and how those lessons appear throughout these documents. We have also worked with other authorizers in developing their policies, so we bring that experience to the table. Lastly, It's important that it's aligned with your Tennessee existing law. So we've looked at the Tennessee Charter School law, and Danelle has helped there as well, and also your State Board of Education master plan. We are going to move through the policies relatively quickly, but I just want to point out this cycle we talked about earlier, because you'll see that the policies work through this cycle. So we start with the establishing expectations on the front end so that everybody, so the school understands what they are expected to do, and that you understand, they understand how they're going to be monitored, et cetera. So important to establish those expectations at the beginning. The next stage is in monitoring their performance throughout the term of their charter. If you need to intervene, if there's a problem, that there's an established way of going through that intervention process. And then lastly, at some point in time, hopefully they will, do well, and they'll be up for renewal in that 10-year period, and that you have the information that you need to make those decisions at the end of their term. So turning now specifically to the draft policies, we have 9 policies that will be developed. And you can kind of see how they cycle from the beginning in terms of looking at your capacity, establishing kind of core principles, goes into the establishing expectations through the application review and the charter agreement. 6.5, 6.6, and 6.7 are all kind of focused on that monitoring, performance, and intervention phase of the performance management cycle. And lastly, towards renewal at the end. And then we will also touch on the unique element if an LEA does, in fact, decide to sponsor a school, and how that process may be a little different. So for 6.1, and I believe you all have copies of the draft policies.
Yes, it's item K, what is it, 3K on the, 2K, I'm sorry, on the agenda for tomorrow, so, okay.
So just recognizing that this is a new role for the state board, we thought it was important to have a mission statement directly tied to the authorizing work. And so we looked to your master plan, which under strategy 2 is to expand families' access to good schools. And if you take a look at the master plan, when it's talking about strategic priority 2, you'll note that it cites the driving belief that parents should be able to choose from among multiple high-quality school options. No child should be stuck in a failing school. And in order to meet this goal, the master's plan states that education stakeholders must increase families' access to high-quality school options, including but not limited to traditional schools, charter schools, and virtual schools. So that's really where we are focusing the mission in that master plan, in that strategic priority 2. So we have the mission here as to increase families' access to high-quality charter schools. Moving on to Principle 6.2, that is where we are establishing the core principles for your authorizing work. And these are the ones we talked about in detail today, and that these are overarching principles that you should refer to throughout your work in this area. And those are to maintain high standards for charter schools, uphold charter school autonomy, and protect student and public interests. Moving on to policy 6.3. This has to do with application review, and it's applications that you are receiving on appeal. You have an existing appeals policy, state policy number 2.5 or state board policy 2.5. That policy has undergone some revisions to reflect this new law. So that policy there talks more about in the appeals, about the appeals process. And 6.3 really focuses on the process of reviewing the appeals and the applications you receive. So an important thing to note there is your standard of review. It does allow for de novo review, so you're allowed to look at the application in its entirety and all of its components. We reference in this policy the statutorily required elements of all charter applications, and that is under, those are set forth in 4913-107, so we made that cross-reference there. And some of those elements you're going to be looking at, just like the district when they receive a charter application, if you receive one on appeal, you'll also be looking at their education program, their business plan, operational budget, governance structure, the host of key components of a charter application. As we mentioned, if district cites substantial negative financial impact in their reason of denying the charter application, the state board is required to look at that financial impact and factor that into their decision. Moving on to more the components of the review process, the policy talks about convening an application review committee, and this review committee will be made up of primarily outside external application reviewers, and they will go through a process to review the application and provide feedback to the state board staff. Another component that is in this policy is the interview of all applicants that are received on appeal, and the focus of this interview is really on the capacity. Do they have the appropriate plans in place to be able to operate the school, and do they have a capacity to operate the school? So that will be a closed meeting, and it'll give the application review team the opportunity to ask some frank questions to the charter school applicant. Another component of the application review policy is this commitment to transparency, to creating transparent processes, making sure the applicants are aware of these processes, and that your board is sticking to the process that you outline. And lastly, we want to make sure that in going towards the goal of informed decision making, this policy also talks about how the staff will make an evidence-based recommendation to the board, and then the board will ultimately decide on the appeal, whether to approve or deny the appeal. Moving on to policy 6.4, charter agreements. This is the policy that's really about establishing expectation, establishing a clear understanding between the parties at the beginning, really the beginning of the relationship. So we note here that it needs to be a written contract that's separate from the application, and it should be a performance-based agreement. These first 2 points you already have noted in your existing charter law. The requirement to have a written contract is in 4913-110, and the requirement to have a performance-based agreement and a 10-year initial term is required by 4913-104. And then we go into what's going to be in this agreement. So we're focusing on the rights and responsibilities of each party. Want to make sure that the charter agreement and this policy notes the different things that should be in the charter agreement, including noting the school autonomies and those required educational obligations, such as number of school days, state mandated assessments, compliance with law, whether it's in regards to serving students with disability, etc. There'll be a component in there that'll talk about the funding mechanism, that you will have an oversight responsibility and what that oversight will look like. The contract will also outline performance standards. So what is the school going to be held accountable for? And we'll talk about the kind of performance standards as we go through additional policies, but those will all be in the contract. And establishing those performance standards initially helps you through, if an issue arises, it helps you through your intervention. If you need to revoke a charter, it's important to know that the school understands the standards that they need to abide by. And then lastly, when you come up for renewal, again, kind of goes back to that stated accountability plan that needs to be in the charter agreement. Lastly, the charter agreement should also specify a closure process. In the unfortunate situation that you do have to close the school, you want to make sure that the school that the closure process is timely, and that you make sure you have all the necessary information from the school, especially when in regards to student records. And lastly, the charter agreement should also talk about the amendment process. If the school needs to change something, when do they have to come back to you? What changes can they make without coming back to the board? Policy 6.5 is the overview of your oversight and evaluation functions. So this is the monitoring performance part of the management cycle. This policy lays out the framework so that you have the ability to understand how your schools are doing. You need to understand how they're performing academically, financially, and organizationally. And, you know, just kind of in referencing back to the principles and standards, I have some page references, so I won't reference them all. But like, for example, this one is really connects to page 17 of the performance principles and standards when it talks about a quality authorizer conducts contract oversight that competently evaluates performance and monitors compliance, ensures schools legally entitled autonomy, protecting student rights, informing intervention, revocation, renewal, and providing annual public reports on school performance. So you kind of see where those components play out in this policy through mechanisms to understand how your schools are performing, by identifying ways to measure this performance. What are the standards going to be? It includes a requirement that the state board through staff conducts site visits of schools on at least an annual basis. It talks about what information or that you need to set up policies or you need to set up processes to make sure that proper reporting is coming to you as the authorizer, and that you're also giving appropriate information and timely information to the schools so they know how they are performing and they are doing in accordance with the agreed upon accountability plan. And lastly, all of this oversight and evaluation and the gathering of information and the establishing processes to measure this performance, it all goes back to your role as a decision maker in terms of if you have to intervene, in the case you need to revoke, and your decision, the high stakes decision ultimately on whether to renew a charter school. Policy 6.6 is an important reminder about charter school autonomy and that charter bargain, the autonomies that they are given in exchange for the accountability and the agreement to improve student outcomes. And so that balance is always there between autonomy and accountability. And so this policy reinforces that concept of the areas that charter schools should have independence over. In terms of decisions about how they manage their schools, how they decide to achieve the standards that you have set forth for them, and about making budget decisions about the best way to allocate their funds. Obviously, there's areas within those where the charter contract and the accountability plan is going to dictate things a little more, and there's other areas where they're going to have greater flexibility. So being conscious of that balance. Another goal is to minimize administrative burden. The focus really should be on the outcomes, So you want to make sure when you're thinking about developing processes for reporting that your reports have a purpose, that they're not duplicative of maybe reports required by another entity or agency. And this probably shouldn't be as much of an issue for the state board, but it comes up from time to time, especially when a district is an authorizer, is that decisions should not be contingent on requiring the charter school to contract with you for certain services. You want to keep, if there is a situation in which the school may contract with you for services, you want to keep that separate from the charter school agreement and your obligation to monitor them. Policy 6.7 goes into intervention in greater detail. Oh, they don't have that one yet. I think we do. It's just the
I don't think we have a 6.7.
you know what? I think you do. I think the heading is just wrong. 1 second. Let me just. I think it says LEA as a sponsor, and it should say, because it says generally, if you go to, it says 6.9 at the top. It should be 6.7 charter school intervention. If you read the purpose that is right below that, it says the purpose of this policy is to set forth the criteria and process for charter school intervention decisions and actions by the State Board of Education. So I apologize, that is mislabeled, and we will correct that.
What is the title again?
The title is Charter School Intervention.
Okay.
So this policy talks about the different processes that should be set up to have a clear and explicit plan for any interventions you may that may arise. So the things that will need to be developed in terms of processes that are set forth in this policy is determining the conditions that will trigger intervention and what type of actions those interventions, what types of actions those conditions will trigger. So a certain type of condition may trigger a letter or a phone call followed up by a letter. More serious ones, maybe it requires an in-person meeting. Maybe it requires a corrective action plan. So this policy talks about what systems you'll need to set in place to have an appropriate intervention. So identifying the conditions, identifying what actions correspond with those conditions. Some authorizers like to create levels of intervention, so it's easy for charter school operators to understand what happens at different phases of intervention. This policy notes that a good intervention policy has notice and cure periods. So as long as there's some infractions that are serious and need to be attended to right away. There's others where you may give them a period of time to cure the issue. It notes that there should be a mechanism if they disagree with your notice, that there should be a mechanism whereby the operator can inform you as to why it disagrees with your with the condition that you think exists. If you do go to the point of developing, if a plan of correction is needed, this policy talks about things that should be in that plan of correction. It should focus on identifications of problems to remedy versus telling them how to remedy the solution. Again, going back to your role and the charter bargain, the goal here is really to let them know what the problems are and not tell them how to solve it. They should have the flexibility generally to implement what plan they want to solve a specific problem. A corrective action plan should be specific, should be extremely detailed in what the issue is. And it should include an applicable timeline. A letter that doesn't include a deadline is not a good, not a good letter, and a corrective action plan that doesn't have a specific timeline is not a good corrective action plan. Again, just important to note here that the policy recognizes that there are certain instances where you may need to step in and have a stronger role. It may be a situation where you need to invoke your power to revoke a charter. And the policy also notes that you can jump levels of intervention. You might start at a level 1, but maybe it's escalating quickly. You don't want to have to go through levels 3, 4, and 5 when something is really serious. So this policy notes that you do have that ability to jump levels if needed. And the last two policies that you don't have a copy of, but we have put in placeholders, is a policy for renewal. The first is for renewal, and the second is for the situations where an LEA may sponsor a school. Renewal, is something that you're not, since you don't have any schools yet, it's not something that is right around the corner, but this is a policy that we're going to be developing in the next couple of months. And then same with the LEA as a sponsor. If an LEA decides to sponsor a school, it won't be coming to you on appeal. It'll be coming to you directly. So we need to develop some policies in order to account for that kind of different avenue in terms of how that application would reach the state board. So that's a quick overview of the policies. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, questions for Alicia? Questions? Yeah, Wendy?
So 6.53D, this is just a hyper-technical question. It says that the school will include measures within the performance standards related to performance on the TCAP. If I was listening correctly this morning, the earliest the school would open with us as an authorizer is 16-17. So, and I don't think we'll still have the TCAP. The state is in the process of trying to figure out where we're going. So I don't know if it makes more sense to amend that later, if it makes more sense to say state mandated assessment or whatever. But
I think that's a good change, yes, thank you.
And state mandated assessment is probably the right terms. Yeah.
We generally tried to use that general phrase, understanding that.
Yeah. Good point. Okay, other questions? I think that, okay, Teresa.
I just had a question as it related to kind of grounds for intervention and consequences. I know we talked a little bit about that this morning. Is that kind of a work in progress? Is that something that the staff of the state board will bring to us to approve, or because this is just the policy setting forth the work, right?
So your question is, as it comes up, will we talk to you guys about what the intervention, why we need the intervention?
And what
Yes.
those interventions might be.
Exactly.
And that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. And then a question about, we mentioned in the policy shared services, and I know we're kind of not there yet, but could you give us some, understanding of what that might look like? And would there ever be, what service agreements what might we have?
We don't necessarily have the mechanisms to provide services
Right, that's what I was
to
wondering.
a charter, but, there may be something that would arise. So we just wanted to have that placeholder there. Okay. But the law does allow them to contract with the LEA in the district in which they will be physically located. So we'll also be, that's totally in their prerogative to do so.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? I think this is very well written, and the session this morning and this session, I think well done. The thing that I have a little bit of trouble with in reading through this is that is where we are not the authorizing agent. It's a lot in here that deals with. I guess where we are, it all deals with it, but some of it really doesn't seem to apply where we don't become the authorizer. I don't know how to, but I guess I kept, in reading through it, I kept trying to get those two things separated and had trouble with that.
Well, that's because these policies only apply to the context in which the board is the authorizer. We have policy 2.500 that talks about the appeals process, and when a charter applies that's not in a priority district, it will revert back to what we've always done. We would just make the decision and remand it back to the LEA.
And I think that's right. The thing that I've focused on is a lot in here that is not in 2.5.
Right, because we wouldn't have.
That would apply where, we don't become the authorizer, where it doesn't get that far.
If you get to these policies, you are, you have assumed the role as the chartering authority. In 2.5, it talks about kind of the remand. It talks about the priority schools. It talks about the whole, when you would become the authorizer, when you would remand. So that language is in 2.5. But if you grant the appeal and they have a priority school and you become the chartering the chartering entity, then bam, you're in this set of policies.
Yeah.
And right now they probably seem like a lot because you don't have any schools. But imagine if you did have a lot of schools, it would be really important to have all these things in place.
But that, in effect, means that the state of Tennessee has two sets of operating guidelines and principles and standards and requirements for charter schools within the state. Those that are LEA authorized and those that are state board authorized. Is that correct?
The review process is going to be the same, but the only difference is when it comes to a school that is in a priority district, then the processes for monitoring, oversight, and all that falls under us because then we are the authorizer. But we will conduct the same rigorous review process. We'll have a charter review committee that's going to look at all the appeals that we get. It's just that the decision point is going to split.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
one question under 6.4, we talked about fee-based services. Are there any fee-based services that are in effect now, or give me an idea of what we may be talking about later as we look at fee-based services under 6.4?
6.4.
Number three. Number three is fee-based services. Number three.
Again, I think that's an issue where right now we don't contemplate those arising. But if a situation like that did arise, I think it's important to note that those should be handled separately. You don't want a situation where where schools, whether they have this as a perception or whether this is reality, where they feel that they have to contract with you for certain things in order, to be approved.
Okay. Other questions? Any other questions? Okay. Very good. Thank you. Appreciate
Thank you.
it. Good job. Okay. We will now move to the educator preparation policy and standards. Sarah. Good afternoon.
You're going to have to listen to me for a little while.
All right.
Between this and our next update, but I'm excited to be here. To make sure it's on. Am I on now? Okay,
Yeah.
there we go. Really excited to bring this first policy to you around educator preparation program approval in Tennessee. As many of you know, this is not the first conversation that we've had about teacher prep in Tennessee. This is really the next stage of an evolving conversation that we've had together over the last year and a half. And I thought, especially with several new members on the board who we're really excited to have join, it might make sense for Mike and Teresa and anyone else, if you'd like to just make a brief comment about sort of the conversation that we've had to date and why we're here at this moment before I jump into the proposal.
Well, you would pick me because I remember sort of starting the conversation on the board. How many teacher prep programs are there in Tennessee?
We have 39 teacher prep programs.
I think that likely there could be a disparity between those, and yet we're issuing essentially a similar license to a potential employer. And we need to be, and this was our discussion, that a license needs to represent to someone that this person is ready to walk into a classroom, and even though they'd be a first-year teacher, have some skill level to perform. And this is, to the department's credit, and we have talked about it over the years. I sat in on a briefing in Knoxville with that region's teacher prep program, and they seemed to get it. They didn't voice any opposition to it. But the truth of the matter is, we're going to have to go to something of a standard that would be recognizable in the United States. And the next thing is, we need to be, if a kid is going into a teacher prep program, particularly if they're going into debt, they need to have some sense that they're walking out with a credential that represents that they've truly been trained to do a job and not have debt and not have that credential. So when I looked over this, when I got the packet, I was elated to see how far we've come.
I just want to echo what Mike said, and this is an effort we've been working at it a long time, and I think the department's taken great steps to get us where we are today. I think over the past few years, we've raised, the selectivity process, raised the praxis scores, and I think, too, over these last few years, we've asked a lot of our teachers, and we need to make sure that when we graduate them, that they're well prepared for the classroom, and I just am excited about this work and look forward to taking it to the next level.
Great, thank you for both those comments. I do want to note on the front end, too, that this is a lot of information. While we have streamlined the policy, I think, down from over 400 pages to close to 100 pages, which I think, again, represents progress in the right direction, I am aware that this is a lot of information, and I'm going to try to kind of keep conversation at a high level today, but please feel free to jump in and ask questions if you have any as I go along here, and I may defer to some of my team members if you ask a question I can't answer. Let's see. So I wanted to start first with talking about some of the great things that our teacher prep programs in Tennessee are already doing, because I think we recognize that while there is a need for change, we also have programs and initiatives across the state that are really showing promising results. And just by way of example, I think a few that are worth mentioning include the Ready to Teach component that requires really rigorous student teaching, the U-Teach model replication program at some of our institutions, and even the EdTPA, which is a new type of assessment that many of our programs are electing to use that really looks at both, film from a student teacher's practice as well as a really rigorous assessment of their instructional skills as they are going through a student teaching program. So I think, while we see things that are really promising, we also know that we need to increase the use of meaningful data to inform both our approval of these programs and the way that they're thinking about designing the curriculum and the training that they provide. I think it's also worth mentioning, too, that we have some programs that are getting great results year after year, and we have an existing state report card that the Tennessee Higher Education Commission puts out, as well as other national reports, including the NCTQ Prep Review, that show that many of our institutions are really getting results with student teachers in a way that results in better outcomes for our K-12 students. So I think, again, on the front end, acknowledging that we really do have some strong programs and practices within many of our programs that we want to make sure this policy builds upon and extends. That said, we know that we have more that we can do to improve the pipeline of teachers in our state. As Teresa mentioned, we've really raised our expectations over the last few years for our teachers in our K-12 classrooms. We've raised our expectations for students and what they need to know and be able to do to graduate and be successful in the world. And so we really need to make sure now that we have coherent and consistent expectations, starting with preparation, so that we're preparing teachers to take on this really challenging work, and that there's not a disconnect between how we're thinking about teacher preparation and what we're expecting of our classroom teachers in Tennessee. And I won't read these quotes to you, but you can see both the CAPE Standards Commission recognizes that, and I think also CCSSO, which is the state chief officers. And Mike mentioned, too, I mean, the meeting that he attended in kind of southeast Tennessee, our programs agree with this. We've worked really hard over the last 8 to 10 months to collaborate with our program providers across the state and to think about what we're really trying to achieve with these policy shifts. And so what you see here is a shared vision that we developed in collaboration with our educator preparation providers. It says the process for approving educator preparation providers supports the continuous improvement of preparation programs in the work of developing teachers and leaders who are able to effectively educate students. And I think that last word, words really, effectively educate students is key, because that really is our key constituency. We are here to all serve our K-12 students, and so really thinking about the role that preparation plays in ensuring that our K-12 students are being served at high levels across the state is key. This is also something that we've worked on with our programs. So a couple kind of overarching goals for what we're trying to achieve with these new policies. The first is to really empower our providers, those that are training teachers across the state, to design programs that meet the needs of our K-12 students, as well as the districts and the teacher candidates that they serve. So we want to give them more flexibility and room to innovate around the way that teachers are trained. We also want to reduce the burden and increase the efficiency of the approval process. Right now, it's pretty cumbersome. It's a lot of paperwork. It's very input-driven. There's a lot of things that programs have to do in preparation for the approval visits and review process. And so wherever possible, we want to reduce the burden and create more efficiencies for our programs. And then additionally, as I mentioned before, we really want to prioritize the meaningful results that we think will continue to serve the improvement process in developing more effective educators across the state. We are generating more data than ever about the performance of our K-12 teachers, and we want to make sure that we're using data in meaningful ways as we reflect back to programs where they're strong and where they're getting results and where they may need to focus further. And collectively, by doing those three things, we think that we'll be able to help elevate the public and stakeholder confidence in the strength of our teacher training programs. We want to make sure that they really are programs that our stakeholders and our public feel are getting results for our teachers and our students. So I want to now look just briefly at sort of the current landscape, because there are a lot of things that are not changing dramatically under this new policy, and so it's probably helpful to see kind of the current landscape and then compare that a bit to the things that are changing. Before I do that, though, there are a number of acronyms that it's probably helpful to just brush up on very quickly. I've mentioned Educator Preparation Provider, which is sort of a mouthful, so we often abbreviate that to EPP. So any place you see EPP, we're talking about the large institution of the teacher preparation program, whether it's at UTK or at Lipscomb or what have you. Within that EPP, so the broad provider, there's also specialty area programs, whether that's secondary math or whether it's elementary education. There's various kind of what we call little p programs that we abbreviate as the SAP, Specialty Area Program. And then two others to just note, the Council for the Accreditation of Educator Preparation, CAPE, is the new accrediting body. I'll talk more about this, but this is the national accrediting body that we are planning to partner with to make these changes across the state. And then finally, the specialized professional associations like the National Council of English, Math, there's various national associations that work to provide guidance for teacher preparation programs across the United States that we refer to as the SPAs. So those are sort of the specialty area, content-specific national organizations. In terms of kind of the brief history of change in educator preparation, it's been a while since we've made any significant changes to our program approval process. But we did as a state, and this was before I came to Tennessee, but in 1988 was sort of one of the first major shifts in the policy direction of teacher preparation. That yielded the NCATE partnership, which we've been working under since 1989. And then there were some slight revisions made in 2001 when NCATE made some changes to their standards. But it's really been quite some time that since we have made some significant changes to our program approval process. I think it's also worth noting here, too, we've talked about this before as a board, but especially for the new members, that the state board has a really key role in approving teacher prep programs. Essentially, the department will conduct the review process, look at the data, and we'll talk about, again, where we're headed with that. But after we make that review and assessment, we'll bring to you recommendations like you have on your agenda for tomorrow for some of our teacher prep programs. And then you, as a governing body, will make the decision as to approve or not approve teacher prep programs across the state. And those are all programs that are training teachers for licensure. This slide we'll have to send you because I think it's really a good one, and it shows you kind of the landscape of teacher preparation in Tennessee. I think I mentioned briefly that we have 39 educator preparation providers in the state, and you can see there sort of the magnitude or size of those programs with respect to the geography of the state. So you can see that they really are across the state. We do have some areas of the state that have fewer providers than others. And it's also worth noting that our largest providers are not always the ones that have the best impact data. It varies quite a bit in terms of, some of the programs we mentioned at the beginning that are noted for having great results year after year. And that does vary. It's not necessarily a function of size or geography. Currently, our programs can choose one of two routes for approval. You ultimately make the decision, but in terms of who facilitates the process for review, it can be a state-approved process, or it can be, right now, NCATE process. NCATE is becoming CAPE. But right now, those standards and the processes are really the same. It's just, is it the state that's facilitating the review, or is it the national accrediting body? And you can see there that it splits in terms of, what programs or how many programs choose to go the state route versus the national accrediting route. And we do not require national accreditation, which is why we have sort of a flexible option. So before we get into the actual policy proposal itself, I wanted to make sure that you knew that we've done extensive engagement with our programs. I believe Susan Benner even with us today, and I'd love for her to join us if you have questions specifically for her. I think Candace McQueen was going to try to join us, but I'm not sure that she was able to be here. But we've worked really closely over the last 8 to 10 months, as I said, to make sure that this is a conversation and a collaborative process, because we know it's going to represent some real work on the part of our programs to adjust to these new standards and some of the new requirements under the policy. So you can see there the different ways that we've engaged, both with TACTI, the Tennessee Association for Teacher Education. We've had individual conversations with many of our leading providers. We've done survey work. We've had community discussions across the state. Mike was able to join us for one of those. We're planning a fourth community discussion with our preparation programs between this reading and the final reading, which will happen at your meeting in October. And then we've also worked really internally at the department to make sure we're drawing on all the right expertise within our department. So working closely with our curriculum and instruction division, with our career and technical, with our special populations staff members, to make sure that all of that expertise is reflected in what you have before you today. So that brings us to the proposed approval process. And again, you have this policy in your packet. It's very, in terms of structure, it's very similar to our current review process. So currently we have, if someone wants to train teachers in Tennessee, the provider applies. They receive conditional approval, which means that they, again, have to meet a number of kind of pre-requirements, and then we work with them over the first 5 years to review their progress against the standards under that conditional approval status. Once they achieve full approval, then they're on a 7-year review cycle under our current process. So there's some kind of lengthy time periods between approval and sort of coming up for reapproval. The proposed process is not terribly different in terms of timelines, but what is markedly different, you'll see, is the annual reporting requirement. And now this is different than the THEC report card that we currently issue as a state. This would require each year data against the standards and impact data particularly to be reviewed at the state level, so that even though the conditional approval would be a 5-year window and the full approval would be a 7-year window, we would be collecting and reviewing data every year within those review cycles. And we'll talk about kind of what would happen if the annual reports showed that a program was not meeting standards sufficiently. There would be some interventions that we could take that currently we're not able to take because we don't have that annual reporting requirement.
So Sarah, does this have anything to do with the impact data that we share annually, the report card, and how does that fit into this new annual report?
It's a great question. So it will not be one and the same. It's not that the THEC report card will serve as that annual report, but a lot of what is included in that current annual report will be part of this new annual report. So it won't just be the THEC measures, which looks at value-added scores. It'll be additional components that we'll talk about a little bit more, that would be a little bit more of a thorough, comprehensive annual reporting process.
But output driven.
Yes, very output driven. Yeah, impact data. So a little bit more on that, specifically, the annual reporting requirements will begin by collecting data. This is new information for the state to review, so we'll go through a period of data collection. We'll work with our stakeholders to determine how to set standards against the data that we'll be collecting so that we know, again, what are our benchmarks, what are our targets that we'll be looking at every year as we collect this information. But to give you an idea of some of the information that would be collected, and so this is to Teresa's question, it's not just TVAS data for recent graduates, but it's also looking at recruitment and selection. It's looking at placement rates, how many of a program's teachers are placed in a K-12 school within, a window of time after they graduate, up to 3 years usually. It's looking at retention of those teachers. Are they staying in the classroom beyond the first year, or are they, again, it's looking at aggregate data. On average, are they not staying in the classroom that long? We're also going to look at completer satisfaction. We're going to have stakeholder surveys that help to assess from the candidate's perspective, did they feel like they were adequately trained? And coupled with that is employer satisfaction. So any district that's employing, X percentage of teachers from a given institution will be surveyed as part of this review process as well, and that will show up in the annual report. We think that's important too, because this really has to be a partnership with our districts. And while we do a lot of lip service to that now, there's not, in most instances across the state, true partnerships between the provider and the district that it's serving, or districts. And then it will also include completer outcomes and completer impact. And that's more of the data that we're used to seeing in the THEC report card. So it certainly will include a lot of that information that we currently share through the THEC report card, but it's also, as you can see, building upon that to kind of, it sort of feels like teacher evaluation deja vu, because it's trying to provide multiple measures of information so that we can assess and help programs to continue to improve and to recognize where they're strong. Any other questions on the annual reports? There's much more information that we'll be building out over the course of the next few months in terms of an implementation plan, which will show you kind of how we're planning to collect this data, what the timelines will be in terms of setting benchmarks. But because this is very new, we're going to need to collect data and look at the results before we can set some of those specific targets.
So will we see, before we vote on this on final reading, kind of an implementation plan with a timeline?
Yes, and I have a high-level timeline to share with you today, but it'll be much more detailed in terms of what you have before you in October.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so in terms of how the annual reporting, what that will trigger. So each year we'll look at this data that we just discussed, and we'll see whether a program, both at the provider level, so kind of the macro educator preparation provider level, and at the specialty program level, is it meeting or exceeding expectations, or is it below expectations? So if you have, and again, it may not be the provider writ large, it may be the secondary math program that's not meeting expectations based on that annual report. Then there would be an interim review, and we need to determine, is it 1 year of data that would trigger the interim review? Is it 2 years of data? That's something that we'll discuss with our program providers over the course of the next few months to come back to you in October with, again, a little bit more of the detail around how that would fold together. But I think it's really important that we use that data to trigger, intermittent interventions where needed. And it may just be one small program within the larger provider, but it'll provide a much more nuanced lens into, where things are going well and where things need to be refocused. Then the comprehensive review, again, will still happen every 7 years, but as you can see, you won't come to a comprehensive review without having 7 years of really rich annual reporting information. So the annual review will happen, the annual reporting will happen each year. The comprehensive review will happen every 7 years, and that will roll together the annual reports, but it will also include a site visit and additional conversation and engagement with the large provider itself. And you can see there are a number of different results that could come to you at the end of a comprehensive review. It could be for another full approval for 7 years. It could be approval with stipulations, minor stipulations, approval with major stipulations, or potentially denial of approval. So there's various levels of approval or denial of approval that could result from that comprehensive review. Questions on that? Okay, and then finally, well, close to final, again, showing you kind of the current versus the proposed. Much of the structure is staying the same in terms of the 5-year conditional approval process and then the 7-year sort of more comprehensive review cycle. Really what's changing, though, is our focus in terms of standards and particularly prioritizing impact data. So currently we use the NCAPE standards. That's shifting to the CAPE standards, and we actually have it noted here as CAPE Plus because in Tennessee we have a lot more data than other states. So our standards under CAPE will look slightly different, especially early on, probably than other states who are still implementing or beginning to implement teacher evaluation systems. We're also moving from sort of Tennessee-developed professional education standards, and that's essentially your pedagogical standards, to the current in-task standards, which most states are recognizing as the most current and up-to-date kind of pedagogical standards. And then in terms of the specialty area programs, this is probably the most major change in terms of, well, NCAPE to CAPE is a major change, but this is another important change. Right now, and this is how we were able to cull from 400 pages to 100 pages. We have a lot of specialty standards on the books that often are out of date almost by the time they come to you, because we know our K-12 education, shifts in terms of standards in a way that it's sort of hard to keep state board policy up to date. So now we're going to give more flexibility to programs to kind of use the various standards that are available that can guide the development of their specialty area programs, and that would include the Tennessee student standards. It would include the current SPA standards, which is often, kind of the single source that people are using now, so that, national education, national math organizations. And then if there are other standards that evolve as national kind of models for how to think about the development of specialty programs, then that would certainly be something they could use as well. And they'll have more flexibility in reflecting to us the standards that they're using. Again, sort of the trade-off is that we're going to be tighter on the outcomes that we're looking for, but we're also going to be looser in terms of allowing them to think about how to innovate and what standards to draw upon. And then the annual reporting, again, was not a part really of the current NCAPE process. That's changing under the proposed policy. And that takes us to, again, a high-level transition plan. As I mentioned to Teresa's question before, we're going to be coming back to you with more details around sort of the data collection process, some of the benchmarks and the other kind of more detailed implementation plans that we know we'll need to put into place to be ready for full implementation by 16-17. But you can see that in the meantime, we're going to be slowly progressing towards that full implementation in 16-17, and that will begin by instituting a data collection this current year, 14-15. So that'll be the first thing that we start to do is this year determine some of the data collection points that we mentioned before and begin collecting that information from all of our providers. And then we'll begin walking them forward towards the new standards. And by 17-18, everything will be implemented. By 16-17, we expect most of these new changes will be implemented. And I will stop there and take questions.
Mike?
I don't suppose there's any way to hurry that more up. That's sort of
Susan?
a biblical time frame there.
It seems, in K-12 perspective, it seems very slow. I agree. I think what we have really learned to recognize, and I think Susan could speak to this, is that for programs who have candidates in the pipeline, they sign on for a 2-year or a 4-year program sometimes, it takes a few years to make those adjustments to the programs and to make good on sort of the courses and the expectations that someone signs up at the front end of a program, in terms of changing too much of it midstream. We're trying to sort of find the sweet spot. But I don't know, Susan, if you have, yeah, great, come join.
So, good afternoon. Thank you. I feel the same way, actually. And the annual reporting is already a part of the institutions in the state that are CAPE accredited. So we are already getting acclimated to that. And so the notion of it becoming high stakes, we cannot sabotage a freshman who has been admitted into a teacher education program without some thoughtfulness about that. But I think that that's one of the reasons why. But I would say, looking at that little, the last row there of annual reports, data collection and review, that doesn't yet necessarily make it high stakes. So I don't see why we could not discuss if the Department of Education has capacity to start the review process a little sooner than is projected there, maybe as a rough draft or as a pilot, so that I don't see a serious problem. It's a matter of is it a high stakes review, and you've really allowed for some stipulations to be put in there, so you could sort of implement this and say it's not we're not going to shut you down overnight, but we are going to start giving you some high warning signals.
I get it. I think, but if I were that freshman, I think I would want the changes in the program as fast as I could, so I'm as prepared. I'm more marketable. I'm more better trained, possibly, if I'm in a program that's going to need some upgrading.
Okay, other questions? Teresa?
Just a quick question related to communication with providers, and so this will come to us on first reading. It'll come back to us in October. What does the communication process look like with providers from where we are today until final reading?
Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned, we've had 3 what we've called community discussions in addition to presenting at the TACD regular meetings and having one-on-one conversations and doing a good bit of survey work as well. We have the results of those surveys if you're interested. I didn't pass them out, but we have that. We are planning one community discussion for sure, which will be kind of a concentrated time to bring our programs together and review the first reading document. We've already begun collecting a lot of feedback from Susan and others of her colleagues across the state on the policy document itself, and so we'll continue to have those one-on-one discussions in addition to the community meeting. And then if we feel the need to have additional regional meetings, we'll certainly be open to holding those as well.
I know Sarah actually came to Memphis for a great dialogue between our education teacher prep providers and our school district and our ASD, and it was really
that last summer?
Conversation, yes, and so we'd love to do that again.
Yes, I would welcome the chance to do that again. That was a great discussion. Yes.
I would love to have a copy of the survey. I'm familiar with what we did when I was on the THEC board, but this would help the learning curve for those of us who've just gotten on this board.
Absolutely. Well, we have copies of that I'll be sure to share.
Thank you.
Today.
Okay, other questions, comments for Sarah? It's excellent work, and I think something that is very, very needed, and I think we can get good results from it. And basically, I see this as with the CAPE standards of basically moving from really focusing on inputs to focusing on outputs, and I think that's where we need to be, and I think it's a major step forward.
Thank you. We certainly think so, and I would be remiss not to give credit to my team. This is certainly not my work. We've worked really hard with our program providers. Amy Wooten's actually not here today, but Michael Durline and Martin Nash from her team are here, and it certainly has been a collaborative effort with our programs. So we feel good about where we are. We're excited as well, and look forward to coming back to you in October.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. think you have the next item on the agenda.
Yes, as I mentioned, you are not done with me yet.
Okay.
And actually, before we get there, I just almost sort of an interlude, I wanted to just put up briefly the other items. These are not things that I'm planning to present on at the workshop today, but these are other items on your agenda. I can take questions about these now if you have them, or we can wait and come back to it after I give you an update on the teacher and principal evaluation systems. It's really whatever your preference would be, Chairman.
Okay, are there any questions on those items that, and we'll have an opportunity to ask those questions tomorrow also, but if
Right.
it's something we could get out of the way today, we could use this as an opportunity to do that.
I may be able, I think so. I brought all of that up here with me. It may take me just a minute, but let's see. So what we just discussed is a first reading item, and it's item G. The final reading items that you have in front of you start with letter J, and then they're really all in a row there. It's J, K, L, M, N. And while you're looking, I think it might be worth mentioning too, Halliday passed out before we started copies of the physical education growth model that's on the agenda list, as well as the 2 administrator evaluation models from 2 of our alternate model districts. And while the rubrics themselves are not subject to policy, they sort of live outside of policy because they often get tweaked sometimes, not usually mid-year, but over time. Wanted to make sure you had those. Those have just been revised based on pilot information this past year, and we're not ready in time for the packets that you received, but you have those now in front of you.
Okay, any questions here? Okay, and again, we'll have a chance to, if there are questions for tomorrow, you have an opportunity there. Okay, teacher and leader evaluation update, Sarah?
Yes, sir. This will be a bit shorter. Again, something that I'll be coming back to you with in October will be kind of our full 2014 comprehensive report on teacher and principal evaluation. I'll mention that at the end here, but in the interim, I wanted to give you a few updates midsummer as we begin looking at the early results for 2013-14 based on data that's been collected this past year. A couple other notable developments I want to touch on. Briefly, want to update you on our principal evaluation work. That's been moving this summer into training and implementation mode. And then again, I'll mention briefly sort of a preview of what you can expect in October on the full report. So the team overall distribution, this is just our observation data, but as you know, we collect observation information from the vast majority of our districts directly into the code kind of state data system. For districts that use alternate models or even their own kind of data system in some cases, we also collect that information. It comes not quite as in real time, but what you see here are just the team districts, so those using the team rubric. But it represents roughly, I would say, 90% of our observation data across the state. We're still waiting for a few of those districts that use their own data systems to submit in some cases. But what I think the headline here is that our evaluation distributions remained really stable this year. You don't see much notable change at all, really, between 12-13, which is the middle column there, and the 13-14 distribution. And we'll talk more about this. I think that's not bad news. We see a lot of distribution across the level 3, 4, and 5, certainly less at the 1 and 2 level, but we're seeing, a little bit more distribution there each year in terms of 1s and 2s on observation. This next slide shows the observation distributions for our alternate models. Now, this data is just from 13-14 to kind of keep the slide from being too cluttered, but you see Coach on the far left, which has, I would say, kind of the greatest range of distribution, and in part that's due to the way they convert their 4-point scale to a 5-point scale. It's also due, I think, in fact, to the state board policy that if you remember their first year of implementation, their scores looked very different, and they made some course corrections at the request of the board to take care of that, and they've really continued to see a really robust distribution since those changes were made 2 years ago. TEM looks very similar to last year. We'll talk more about that here in a minute. We've been working with Shelby County to make some adjustments that I think will actually pay bigger dividends in terms of their distribution data next year. We feel good about the changes that they're making, but those changes were made sort of midstream this year, and I don't think are going to be. This isn't the total. This is just their overall distribution data. We haven't actually been able to look at their teacher level data yet, but we'll be doing that over the course of the next month or so. And again, at a future slide here, I'll show you a little bit more about the plans to work with Shelby County. And then Tiger, while that looks like it's skewed very high, and it is, they have a lot of 4s and 5s. They actually had really high growth as well. It's 12 small districts that are using the Tiger model, and so when you look at misalignment, they actually do pretty well because their growth really did match up with their observation data. Again, please stop me if you have questions. This slide continues to illustrate that observations are predictive of growth. It's less important to see which year is which in terms of those lines, but there's a clear pattern over the last 3 years here that shows that evaluators do a pretty good job of rank ordering teachers, particularly the 3, 4, and 5 range, but increasingly we see a little bit more distribution between 1 and 5. And if you can see that. I'll send these slides out as well after the workshop today. But it's also sort of interesting as you look at the top end of the slide that 5s on TVAS actually don't get 5s on observation. Their observation average is below a 5. It's in the 4.2 range. So again, just sort of interesting to see that we continue to track in a way that's predictive of growth. This slide, again, shows the misalignment rates across the models. We talk about misalignment as being sort of a pattern of misalignment potentially in a school if there are observation scores that are 3 or more levels removed from the individual growth score for a teacher, and if we see that pattern across the larger teacher population within a school. So this shows, the team model the last 3 years, the coach model, the Tiger model, and the TIM model. We haven't been able to get that information yet this year. But you can see, I'm sorry. We will be getting that. We have their overall distribution data, but we don't have teacher level results from them yet because they use a separate data system. So it was just a matter of timing. We'll be looking at that with them over the next few weeks, but it was not ready for today. But I'll certainly come back to you. So again, I think there's not much change in the misalignment rates across team and coach and Tiger. Tim is the one we'll be working with potentially again next year, and I apologize that data wasn't ready today, but I think generally speaking, misalignment is not something that's increasing dramatically across these models, which is good in that it means that teachers are receiving more consistent feedback between observation and growth. Also wanted to talk very briefly about our team coaches. You all have heard me speak of this work, I think, at some of the past meetings, but we have 8 coaches that work regionally to provide both targeted support to schools that are identified as potentially needing more support based on misalignment. That work is continuing to evolve. It's not just the support schools that those team coaches work with, but we are continuing to see a really positive impact in the schools in which those team coaches are working. And it's interesting that it's both a numbers game in terms of misalignment is reduced. It's also the case that we see student growth really improving in those schools, and it's outpacing our state growth in years that we've had historic state growth. So it's notable that it's not just about alignment, but it's actually when people get better at evaluation and feedback that students grow more, which is really exciting. And I think even further with this work, we've seen that while I think most administrators who are on the support school list would admit to you that they are not excited to be identified as needing support. We've had various focus groups with some of those school leaders over the last few months, and they feel really positive at the end of the year typically about the work because it really is support, it's coaching, it's going in and assessing. In most cases, there's a number of things that just need to be addressed, and with additional support and coaching from the team coaches, those principals have become real supporters of the work. So it's great to see that they're having a positive impact. We also see that it's not just the 1 year of intervention where things improve, but since we've done this for a couple of years now, we see that even in schools that received support, say 2 years ago, their alignment scores, their alignment data, and their growth scores continue to improve the year after the intervention. So it seems to have a lasting impact. we're continuing to evolve their work, and I think this year will be the first year where it's not just support schools that those team coaches are working with, but also some of what we're calling our good to great schools. So those schools that are looking to take their practice even further. And in some cases, that may be a school that was on the support school list the previous year that wants to continue that work. In other cases, it may be schools that are just looking for a little additional support to move their practice. Any questions on team coaches? Real briefly, a couple other things to note in terms of developments. We'll get into more of this at the October meeting when I bring back kind of the full report from 2014. But our student survey results in the districts that are using student surveys, which is roughly 20 of our districts, continue to appear to be predictive of both observation and growth. So that continues to be exciting to see an additional measure of teacher impact in the districts that are using the student surveys. We're excited next year to explore even some additional instruments, not just the tripod survey, but the field is beginning to really expand in terms of the providers in this space around student surveys. So that's something that we're looking forward to continuing. We also just did a survey of our districts around some of the flexibility options that they have. What we've seen in terms of satisfaction around evaluation is that where districts are able to choose whether it's components of their evaluation or the model itself, they tend to rate evaluation higher in terms of satisfaction. So we want to make sure that districts really understand what flexibility they have even within the team model. And we see that 80 districts are planning to take advantage of some of those flexibility options that exist within your current policy. And that means, not necessarily using an alternate model, but using some of the flexibility that exists, whether it's, the number of observations that they're performing for a given group of teachers, or co-observations, or other kinds of practices that are actually more customizable at the local level. And then we're also making progress, I think, on the individual growth score coverage. One of the items that you have before you is a PE model that has been piloted now kind of in 2 iterations over the last 2 years. And that is ready for your approval tomorrow, and would mean that districts across the state could use that as a way to assess growth in a PE teacher's classroom. So in addition to the PE model, again, that's on your agenda this time, we're planning to pilot a pre-KK model in the same sort of vein over the course of the next year. That's something Shelby County has been interested in leading. We think Metro may also be interested in various other districts. So that's something just to kind of keep on the horizon. Real briefly, circling back to the TEM model, so the teacher evaluation model in Shelby County, I mentioned that we had been working with them because their misalignment data last year triggered some additional state conversation, and we've been working with them to kind of dig into that and understand, why the scores changed pretty dramatically last year in terms of observation and growth. One of the things that we think was at issue was some of the way that things were calculated within the rubric. So they're making some adjustments to their rubric itself, eliminating one component in particular that seemed to inflate scores across the board. They're making the level 5 descriptors even more rigorous so that, again, it becomes more clear what the kind of ultimate expectation is across the various indicators in their rubric. And they're also incorporating more student-focused language in the indicators so that, again, it's not just about the teacher, but it's really about what is the teacher kind of facilitating in terms of student behavior in the classroom, which is much more in keeping with kind of our new Tennessee student standards. Those are the big changes that they're making, again, that I think will continue to help their observation scores come back into alignment with individual growth. They're still, like other models, making some additional changes to their alternate educator rubrics, so people who are counselors or other non-classroom based staff. And they're also looking at some of their processes to include more self-assessment, focus more on unannounced visits, and some of those things, again, that I think will contribute to their overall data. But in addition to those changes, we're planning to continue to work with them over this next year. We're going to be diving into their data more deeply once we have their teacher level results. We're going to be meeting with their school leader coaches, their ILDs, to share some of our team coach practices that we've seen successfully work across the state as they prepare for next year. And then we'll be doing regular data checks and sort of more shadowing in the district over the course of the next year to support them over the 14-15 school year. Any questions on that?
Question?
I have a question on the PE rubric, how will this be, or how has it been in the pilots, applied to students with disabilities, particularly physical or developmental disabilities? How will that interaction happen?
That is a great question. I may have to defer to my experts in the crowd, because I'm not as familiar with that component. This is Courtney Seiler, who works on our team. She's one of our team analysts, and she's been leading a lot of the work on the PE model.
So you'll see in the PowerPoint deck that has, I think it just has 9 slides. It talks a little bit about the process that when teachers are submitting these portfolio models, they're able to choose a purposeful sample of students. So we know that those teachers are teaching a huge course load. So if they have students who have severe physical capabilities, have IEPs, have other disabilities that prohibit them from performing at that level, they would not be required to include those students. They are asked to include students at different ability levels, but it's at the teacher's discretion, and usually we ask that they work with their principal and other school leaders to determine which students are appropriate to include.
Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
Almost finished.
Okay.
Tiger, quickly, this is kind of a headline in terms of change for them. They are now going to be using the team rubric. So they are choosing not to use what they had been using in terms of the Tiger-specific model, but using the team rubric, but continuing to layer on sort of their specific process and overtime support, as well as sort of the summative scoring model that they've been using. So we think this will make it even more accessible for other districts who are interested in using some of their kind of support and scoring processes that are still specific to the Tiger model, but they are going to be using the team rubric and moving to the state data system. And then the Achievement School District is also making a few changes to their model that we wanted to update you about. They are narrowing it a bit. They're cutting out some of their indicators to focus more specifically on some instructional practices that they see as most effective. And they're also adjusting some of their processes to focus on coaching and support. Last thing I wanted to mention was the principal evaluation. This is something that I've talked to you about at various meetings, but we have, as you know, completed a successful pilot this past year, 13-14. We've made changes since the pilot period based on feedback from those pilot participating districts, as well as the advisory council that worked with us on kind of the changes that were going to be made based on the feedback we were collecting. And all of that has resulted in what we feel like is a really strong rubric that focuses on the core competencies of school leadership, specifically teacher development, how you leverage educator strengths and think about shared leadership, and making sure that, again, students are having access to rigorous standards in all classrooms, and that there's a focus on instruction. Again, all of those things are reflected in this new rubric. We've also been piloting a teacher perception survey as part of that work that essentially asks teachers to assess a principal against those same indicators, and people have found that to be another really helpful source of evidence for assessing a principal's performance. It's not required, it's an optional tool. So right now we're in the period of doing summer training and certification on this new rubric, and then we're planning various methods of kind of providing through-year supports this coming year as people begin to use that new rubric in the field. Finally, looking at teacher evaluation for 14-15, you know, as we kind of scan the landscape and talk with educators and look at our stakeholder survey data, you know, people feel pretty comfortable, I think, now with the process. Observations are happening, feedback conversations are happening. The rubric is something that has become more familiar, and people are using that language more frequently in conversations across our schools. So where we really think it's time to focus our attention is on the quality of feedback that teachers are receiving. So we know people are comfortable with the process, but are teachers really receiving high quality feedback in every instance, and the kind of feedback that's going to help them to improve their instruction? And I think we would all agree across the state that there's room for us to continue to push and improve on that piece. And similarly, how are we using the data to make meaningful decisions about, you know, which teachers, you know, are eligible for additional responsibilities and leadership roles within a school? How are we thinking about staffing and creating student assignment plans based on where we know our teachers are strong and where they struggle? So in addition to those two areas of focus, we're also continuing to develop strong practices and make sure that we have opportunities to share those things across districts at our various conferences and regional meetings. Things like student surveys, co-observations, which seems to be a really promising way of making sure that feedback is improving, and some of the portfolio growth models that we've talked about today. All that to say, and I promise I'm almost done, I will be back in October to talk to you more specifically about some of the 2014 results. We're working really hard on a pretty comprehensive report Now that we've had 3 years of implementation under our belt, we want to make sure that we're reflecting back to our educators, to the state, and to the national conversation around teacher evaluation, all the things that we're learning, and what adjustments we think still need to be made so that we can continue to improve the way that evaluation is serving teachers and serving students. I think that's all I have for you.
Okay. Questions for Sarah?
Yes,
Carolyn?
Mr. Chair. Sarah, I just wanted to ask, as you look back now on the last 3 years, what's your feeling about having the different models of evaluation versus having a consistent model across the state?
Particularly the observation models. I continue to be a big believer in the kind of cross-pollination. I think we learned so many interesting things from the different models, whether it's, in Memphis, using student surveys for 5%. Now that's something that other people can use, but that wasn't part of the state model initially. Even with Tiger, using the team rubric, I think what we see is that it's less about the rubric and it's more about how people are using it and how they're customizing it for the local context. And so I think we want to continue to encourage districts to take ownership of evaluation, whether that's a slightly different rubric, like for Coach and for Tim, or whether it's using the team rubric, but really thinking about the needs of their teachers. So I think our context across Tennessee varies so much that evaluation really needs to be flexible. I think it's sort of the tight, loose kind of conundrum. You want to be tight enough on the things that you think everybody should be doing and doing well, but then loose enough to allow that flexibility to continue to customize. So I don't think we're yet at a place where it would make sense to move to one rubric or one model. I think, if anything, we really want to see our districts take more ownership of the model that they're choosing and make sure that it's working to improve the quality of feedback that teachers are receiving.
I guess it's nothing like having some ownership to encourage good implementation.
That's right.
Other questions? One of the things, Sarah, that you mentioned, I think is very important. I think probably the most important outcome from what we've done with teacher evaluation is the quality of the feedback that's being provided between the principal or the evaluator and the teacher. I think that has just picked up enormously, but I think there's still, as you indicate, a lot of room for improvement. I think it's very appropriate to focus on that and to continue to emphasize the importance of that.
Yeah, we
But
would agree.
the improvement that has occurred over the last 3 years in that respect, I think, is immense. The other thing I guess I would like to see you encourage on a statewide basis is greater use of student survey data. I'm a strong believer that there's real value there, and I think it needs to be weighted higher than 5%, and it needs to be considered every place.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I think actually having more options available and reports that teachers find actionable and useful may help kind of spread that further.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Okay. Sarah, thank you. Let's take about a 10-minute break, and we'll come back and address the rest of this agenda. So 10 minutes. Okay, let's reconvene. Okay, the next item we got on the workshop agenda here is the state data and the chemistry performance levels. And Aaron has that, so Aaron, it's yours.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Erin O'Hara, Assistant Commissioner for Data and Research. And I'm going to go through first briefly state level results, which hopefully y'all have seen from the governor and the commissioner's announcement, which was a few weeks ago. And then also you have in front of you both the PowerPoint that I'll be presenting as well as this chart of state level results. So hopefully y'all have actually seen this before and this won't be anything new for you. But just to give you a general overview, so I'll talk a little bit about 3 through 8, then I'll talk a little bit about high school, and then I'll talk about sort of the whole of what we saw this year. So in grades 3 through 8, in all of the major subjects, so math, reading, science, and social studies, which is not included on here, scores were within a point, 1 percentage point of last year's results. So scores showed slight increases in math, science, and social studies, and slight decrease in 3 through 8 reading. Of note, more than half of 3 through 8 students are now on grade level in math, as compared to 34% when we switched standards back in 2010. So we feel good about the progress that we've been making over the course of the last 4 years. And I'll say this again in a minute, but this was a year of transition for Tennessee teachers and students. We fully implemented the new standards in math and reading. And to see where we're in, within a point of last year in a transition period is actually, we feel, fairly positive. So where we had our big growth this year was in high school. And in particular, high school students made gains on 5 of 7 end-of-course tests. One area that we've highlighted in high school, actually over time, has been proficiency in Algebra 2. So where Algebra 2 started when we first tested back in 2010, 2011, in the 30s, we're now almost there at 50%. And so that's 6 percentage point gain over last year, 17 percentage point gain over the original test. And that's with all students taking that Algebra 2 test. So we've now fully implemented the standards to where students are taking 4 years worth of math and all students are taking Algebra 2. So we feel like this is really positive momentum in high school and particularly in the algebra. And so again, I said this before, but generally, what are the trends that we saw this year? So we saw essentially flat growth in 3 through 8 in a year of new standards. We saw some good gains in our high school performance, and in particular, I think we're encouraged by the Algebra 2 results. One other thing that we saw that we found encouraging, achievement gaps for minority students narrowed in math and reading at 3, 8, and high school levels. That's not within this data. That data is available if you'd like to see it on our website. I'm also happy to send any of that information to y'all. So that is essentially what I have on state level results. And if you have any questions, happy to take any questions before I move on to the chemistry information.
Question for Aaron? Yeah.
When will the district data be available on the report card?
Yep. So we will release district level results next week, and then the report card is available November the 1st. And so there will be more information on the report card. We will do the same thing we have done over the last several years, which is to release district level information at the aggregate, and then we'll release school level information in mid to late August, and then the report card will be released in November with more data.
Does the November report card include the high priority list? Are you going to be rerunning the high priority list?
Yep.
And
So
when does that happen?
We will be bringing the priority list to y'all in the end of August.
Okay.
So that will be happening over the next couple of weeks from the perspective of us doing the work, and then we'll be bringing it to you all at the end of August.
So we'll need to have a call meeting?
Correct.
That, okay. Okay.
We'll need to compare our calendars and find a date while we're all together.
Yeah, at the same time that we bring you all that information, we'll be bringing you annual measurable objectives for the coming year as well. So we have generally over the last couple of years come to you for a special meeting that brings you both the school lists as well as the AMOs, both of which we need to do by September the 1st by law.
Okay, questions? Aaron, I continue to, I guess, hear from teachers that, that they, in number of systems, that they fully implemented Common Core this past year, and that they don't feel that the TCAP is aligned as well as it should be to Common Core, and that was the reason that they didn't get the kind of results that they thought they were going to get or should be getting. To what extent is that, in your assessment, a valid concern?
So that's something that we've heard from people, I'd say statewide, and I think that it is true that we are teaching standards that are challenging students' higher order thinking skills, and we have a test that is still a bubble test. And I think that is an issue for people as we go through what was meant to be a one-year transition and now has become a two-year transition.
So we have that same problem the coming year, perhaps to a greater extent, in that we're more fully implemented Common Core. Is that?
I think we will have the same. We have a test that is based on the same sets of things that we had tests based on this year, and so until we transition to assessments that are based more fully on the Common Core, I think we'll continue to see people struggle with how to adjust.
Okay. Other questions? Okay.
Okay, so Chemistry. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things here. So first, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what we did and sort of the process for the chemistry assessment. I'll review for you all what the standard settings process is, and then I'm going to talk about the recommendation that we're going to have for you tomorrow on final reading. So first, chemistry. So we field tested the chemistry end of course test last year. We had our first operational test this year. We had around 60,500 students that were tested, and as I'll explain in a minute, the process of sort of how we go through this, we did the standard setting working with a panel of educators in June of this year, and I'll talk through the entire process here in a minute. So before I get into that, why do we do standard setting? So the reason why we do standard setting, the whole process, is to end up with proficiency level cut scores so that we can determine what means proficient. So what scale score can we call proficient? What scale score do we call advanced, basic, et cetera? And the standard setting process involves educators, specifically so we can have educators take a look at all of the items that are on the assessment and make a recommendation about what they think proficient means. One of the other things that we have done in the last several years, in part because this body has asked us to, is to make sure that when we're looking at these types of things, we're looking at the relationship between what we're seeing on proficiency levels and other indicators of college and career readiness. So when we do this work now with educators, we are bringing that kind of information to them. We are then bringing that kind of information to y'all. So as you're thinking about what we do here, you can be thinking not only about the information that we have, but also about how we compare that with college and career ready indicators. So what happens in the standard setting process, and this is a little bit also sort of what happens in the assessment process overall, and I've talked through this with you all at various times, but just to give a bit of a refresher on this. So the first thing we do when we create a new assessment is we determine what are the standards that we want to assess. Once we have the standards that we want to assess, we design the test, we field test items, we do all of that work of actually administering the assessment. So how do we then work on setting the standards themselves and doing proficiency levels and cuts? What we do after we have set the standards is we take a look at what should be the level of expectation for each performance level, for each proficiency level. So how would you define, based on those standards, based on that test, what basic looks like, what below basic looks like, what proficient looks like, what advanced looks like. These are called performance level descriptors, and this is information that we work on with educators, and then we review with the educators when we do standard setting to make sure that they feel like the performance level descriptors that we have are accurate for this particular test. So we convene the educators both to discuss performance level descriptors and then also to look at the information for actually setting a cut score. So using the content knowledge that they have to help us look at that test and say where on that test should we set the level of proficiency. After we do that process, we then review those recommendations with our technical advisory committee, and I'll talk in a minute about who's on our technical advisory committee and sort of what that group looks like. But this is a panel of national experts on assessment, on standard setting, on all of these sort of psychometric topics that we talk about. We review that information with them and hear their recommendations so that we can bring outside recommendations and sort of outside expertise to you all in addition to our own recommendations as we all together are thinking about how we set these levels of cut scores. And then finally, we recommend a cut score to you all, and then you make a decision about that score and accepting and approving cut scores, and that's how we set what proficient is for any assessment that we have in the state. So what does the actual standard setting process with educators look like? So what we do when we do standard setting is we, again, invite in a group of educators, and I'll talk in a minute about what that group looked like for this test. We take all of the questions that are on the operational assessment, we place them in order from least difficult to most difficult. This is called bookmarking, and we ask educators to spend some time walking through those items and placing literally a bookmark at the point at which they think a student would have answered enough questions correctly to be considered proficient. They do this over the course of a couple of days. So this one was actually over the course of 3 days, but the discussions took place over the course of 2 days. They go through and together in small groups, they have conversations about where they think that proficient level should be set. We then introduce various information to them about that after they've made their initial recommendation. They make their initial recommendation. We then bring them data that says, okay, here's what the proficiency level would be and what the percentage of proficient advanced would be if it's set at that level. Here's comparable data. Here's biology information. Here's data on ACT science. Here's data on Explore science. So that they have a variety of information at their fingertips to look at, well, here's what I think based on the performance level descriptors, based on the chemistry standards, based on the test, and then also they have this other data that comes in to help them make a sort of well-informed decision, and they're encouraged to then have discussions about that. Then they do a second round, have more discussion, then they do a third round. And so all of this takes place, as I said, over the course of a couple of days. We are always cognizant of trying to get teachers that have experience with diverse populations, teachers that come from a variety of places within the state, so we're covering the 3 grand regions, so that we also make sure that we have that these educators have had experience with chemistry and hopefully also with other subject matter. So as we talk about proficiency levels, where do we use proficiency levels? And I think this is important information for y'all to have as you're thinking about this. So we use proficiency for school and district AMOs, though it's important to note that for this purpose, we don't use science in AMOs. So science is not used in school or district AMOs for that purpose. We also use proficiency in school accountability. So the school lists we were just talking about, priority, focus, and reward, all include science data, and the success rates that we do for those schools are based off of proficient cuts. So what percentage of students are proficient or advanced? And that does include science data. So chemistry data will be included with priority, focus, and reward schools. We don't use proficiency levels at all in TVOS. So TVOS is based off of scale scores. It's not based off of proficiency levels. And we don't use proficiency levels in student grades. So when you're thinking about what proficient means and why we use it, we should be thinking about this in terms of school and district accountability. And for the purposes of chemistry in particular and science, it is only really looking at school accountability and what we report on the report card. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the recommendations and the process that we went through sort of after the educators had discussed the recommendations, what other data we looked at, and what our ultimate recommendation to you is. So the educator recommendations, as you can see, are there in that line, the third line down that says recommended. And so you see the recommendation for proficient was 718, so a scale score of 718. And if the proficient cut were set at that point, 44% of students would be considered proficient or advanced. What you see above and below are what we call standard errors of measurement from that recommendation. So when you have a group of educators and when you're doing 3 rounds of information and they're putting that proficient level at different points in the conversation, what you want to make sure that you're doing is you're looking not just at what the ultimate recommendation is, which is the mean of all of the different tables, but also one of the things that the TAC has recommended to us is that you still maintain that standard error of measurement from the recommendation above and below, and you consider that as you're considering the recommendations and then other data that you bring to bear on the recommendations. So the slide you have below that in your packet, I'm going to go forward, but if y'all want to keep looking at these 2 slides together, I think it's important to see the data of the educator recommendations next to some related scores. So as we have brought you all over the past couple of years, Algebra 2 and English 3, one of the first questions that the State Board asked of us was, what's the relationship between where you're setting this cut score and the ACT College Readiness benchmark? So we, within this whole process, one of the steps that we always take is then to compare the ACT scores and the chemistry scores and do a process we call equipercentile, where we look at what the relationship is between those 2 scores. So what you have here is where, if you were to look at chemistry scores and ACT scores, where that common point is. So ACT College Readiness Benchmark, the ACT actually moved their college readiness benchmark for science from 22 to 23 on the ACT last year, so I think that's sort of a relevant point of information as we're having this conversation. But if you look at the ACT College Readiness Benchmark set at 23, that would be a scale score of 745. So if you look up above, that is outside of that range of recommendations that educators had made, right? So 745 is actually above that +2 standard errors of measurement. If you look at the plan, so the plan being the 10th grade test that students take, and the college readiness benchmark there at a 22, that's a scale score of 741, which again falls just outside of that range, but important information to have nonetheless. And one of the things to know about plan, again, is that's 10th grade, which is usually when most students are also taking the chemistry test. So what we did then was to look at how, we looked sort of at how within the range of ACT scores where various scale score cuts would fall. And what we found was that actually a 726, which is that one standard error of measurement from the educator recommendation, fell within the range of 21, which, as you all know, is what is needed for a student in Tennessee to be to qualify for the Hope Scholarship. So this is a relevant piece of information for us, particularly here in Tennessee, and I'll talk in a minute about how ACT does and doesn't relate to the chemistry test. But I think we think that also the Hope Scholarship cut point of that 21 is a relevant piece of information for us in terms of what college and career ready in Tennessee means. So this is just, again, a reminder about our TAC and sort of who our TAC is. So we took all of this information, the statistical analysis we had done, the educator recommendations, to our TAC and said, help us to look at sort of where you all think we should be. So just to remind you all of who this group is, again, national experts in testing, and two of the members are really considered the nation's foremost experts on standard setting. So we had a call with this group of people to review the information. This is a group we meet with twice annually to help us think about how we want to make recommendations to you all how we want to make these kinds of decisions. Ultimately, they make a recommendation to us. We consider their recommendation to make a recommendation to you all. So one of the things we always ask the TAC to do is to help us make sure that we've designed a standard setting that that has fidelity to it, that is a valid plan according to how this is done nationally, how the sort of best practice for standard setting is. And they very much felt like that was the case. One of the first things that they said was, yep, you should always sort of be looking at that standard error of measurement recommendation, and you can really fall anywhere within that, but you might want to think about if you're going to go outside of that to standard errors, you might want to really think about why you're doing that, and if you feel like you need to move in that direction. Two things we had a good bit of conversation about was the relationship between the ACT science test and the chemistry test. So ACT science does not assess the same information as the chemistry test does. So there's some chemistry information on the ACT science test. There is a good bit of biology on the ACT science test. So these are not perfectly aligned tests. So their caution to us was, yes, it's important to think about college and career readiness, but think about whether or not the ACT is sort of the perfect measure of college and career readiness for y'all, and if not, what else you might want to bring to it so that you can be sure that you're not overstating the importance of the ACT, but that you're also considering the importance of the ACT. They also wanted us to be sure to think about, just generally speaking, what are the implications of the ACT test for a student, what are the implications of the chemistry test for a student, and how would this influence sort of how much emphasis is put on the chemistry test or the ACT test in the classroom. Again, sort of the overall point being ACT is an important bit of information, but especially in chemistry, especially with science, shouldn't necessarily be the primary driver of where we set a cut score in the way that we might consider it to be more that way with English and with any of the math tests, to where those are sort of more closely aligned. So ultimately, in conversation with board staff and with the chairman and with the commissioner, where we landed was on a scale score of proficient at 726, which is that level that I mentioned that is related to a 21, which is related to the Hope Scholarship. It's that one standard error of measurement from where the educator recommendations were, so very comfortable within the range of making sure that we are looking at the recommendations of the experts on this, but also that we're bringing to the conversation some information about how tests such as ACT can help us to determine what college readiness means in Tennessee. So this is the recommendation that we will bring to you all tomorrow. Happy to talk about any questions about the process, about sort of where we landed and why.
Okay, questions for Erin?
I do have a question.
Okay, Lee?
I'm noticing that on page 6, where the educator recommendations are outlined,
Yep.
the basic is 684.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm sorry I didn't mention it.
Okay.
So one of the things that we noted was that to move fully to the one standard error of measurement, we would end up with a more disproportionate amount of students at basic and below basic than we currently have in any other test at basic and below basic. So it felt as though it would be reasonable to accept the educator recommendation there at 684 because it gives us a good balance at this point, which gives opportunity for growth.
Thank you.
I have a question. How often are the cut scores recalibrated?
So we only would recalibrate cut scores when we have a substantial change to the standards, or we have new standards, or if we design an entirely new assessment. So this would be the standard that would last until we got to a point of new standards or a new assessment. We also you all could choose to, at any point, ask us to review a cut score. We could at any point bring to you a recommendation to review a cut score. But usually we only do that in the context of new standards and new assessments.
So it would have to be potentially recalibrated when the new test is decided upon?
Correct.
Teresa?
Aaron, I just remember when we were going through the Tennessee Diploma Project and the raising the academic standards there, we actually hired an external validator, you know, when we went through the standard setting process. And I know now we have the TAC. I don't remember if we had the TAC before review committee. Do you think we need it, or because you do have you have assembled a really strong
Yeah, I think that
national committee?
I think what we would say is that our TAC now, I think, really serves in that same capacity. And I think that at first, when we were first engaging that group and we didn't know them as well and we didn't spend as much time with them, and honestly, when they hadn't reviewed the plans for the assessment. So one of the things we do with them is we review the entire draft for the assessment. We review the statistical data that we get from the field tests. We review all of that type of information. When we were first doing those assessments that you're referring to, we didn't have the same kind of TAC in place, and we had not reviewed with the TAC all of the information that we have. So we hadn't sort of we've gone from soup to nuts with them. And so this is a group that I feel very much serves as that outside perspective.
Teresa, remember that when we were doing diploma project, we were moving from 8th grade math with a 92% proficient rate. Right. So it was a different environment. I'm really comfortable with what they've done here.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Aaron, could you go through on the TAC recommendation on page 7? The consider the implication of the ACT as compared to the TCAP?
Yeah.
Would you walk through that?
So one of the things that the TAC always asks us is what is a test used for? And based on what a test is used for, then what is the motivation for the student and in how they approach that assessment? And so this is a test that is used in student grades. This is a test that is therefore, in some senses, used. It's not a high school graduation exam per se, but that information does factor into a student's information as they're going through high school. It is also a test that is used for the purposes of teacher evaluation. And so the motivations are different when you're talking about a student and their grade and a teacher and their evaluation than necessarily are with ACT. And that is important for students. It is required, but it is not used in all the same ways.
Any other questions? Aaron, good recommendation, and I think a real good process of going through and determining that. We've set this up for final reading.
We have, and I can talk a little bit about why.
That's
so,
my question.
Yeah, because this information, so we did already, because we base TVOS on scale scores, we were already able to include the chemistry information in the TVOS scores. So we've already done that. What we've not been able to do at this point is to actually report back to schools and districts on how students have done in chemistry. And we'd like to be able to do that as soon as we possibly can, given that they'll want to be looking at that for the coming year, given that for the next round of, and I think I indicated that we would bring chemistry as part of the school designations. We won't do that this year, but for coming years, that will be included. And so it is important that we have the information as soon as we can. So that's why we have it for final reading now. It is obviously within your power, if you'd like to say that we'd like to do another set of information around this or take that time. I think the reason why we feel this is important is that this is the kind of information that people like to have as soon as possible at the beginning of the year so that they can be planning for their courses and how their students are going to perform, et cetera.
Okay, I think that it is important to get this information out for that planning, and I think one of the things that this board is focused on is trying to really push the schedule and getting all the information back quicker than we're able to get it back in most cases. So I think that is important. I think the board just needs to recognize in approving this on final reading that it's a little bit of it is a deviation from our standard process. We would normally have something like this go through 2 readings, but have in the past made exceptions where we felt like there was reason to do so.
And I do believe that in the past we have done these same standard setting on final reading in the summer for the same reasons that I just outlined. So unfortunately, it's just a compressed time frame from when we do the test, when we're able to pull educators in, do the analysis, and then get it to y'all. So we've sort of moved this along as quickly as we could.
Okay. Other questions? Okay. Aaron, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Good work. Okay, we'll now move to questions on the agenda item. We've addressed some of those, but what other questions does the board have for items that are on the agenda tomorrow that we haven't yet addressed?
I have a question maybe for Danelle, I think, maybe, on the special ed 60-day evaluation, the exceptions. Am I putting you on the spot? You may not be able to answer today, but I didn't want to wait until tomorrow if I could get an easy answer today. It appears, it's first reading, so we're fine. If not, it's exceptions to the 60-day evaluation window for kids with disability or suspected disabilities. And I guess my question was, in the writing of it, and this may be for the person who wrote it, it doesn't appear in the rule that there is an outside. So if the 60 days is waived, it doesn't appear clear how much time the district then has to complete the evaluation, and that's one of my concerns. I think under the IDEA, I'm not aware of these exceptions existing. I know it says that the U.S. Department of Ed was consulted, so I may need to wait till tomorrow.
Yes, and we will have a public hearing between now and on final reading, but I'll get a straight answer for you on that.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, other questions?
I have one more legal. I'm sorry.
Okay, good.
Newbie. One more legal question on the teacher revocations and reinstatements. I just want to make sure I am clear. The ones that are appearing in front of us, these are not statutorily ineligible, right? So these are ones that the board could reinstate or could not revoke legally.
The only one where we really are bound by the recommendation is Kimberly Atkinson Bryant, and that is because she still is indicated by the Department of Children's Services, and under DCS rule, the state board cannot allow someone to be licensed if they have an indication.
And all the other ones are not. I'm not saying I'm going against. I'm just making sure that there's nothing in law that requires us to rule a certain way on any of those.
That's correct.
Okay, just want to make sure.
And also, I might just mention for our new members that we've got a lot of these each meeting, and we really depend on the staff to go through them very carefully, make sure that we're doing what legally we have to do or is appropriate, and the second thing is we're going back and making the comparisons to the previous action so that we are consistent with the actions that we've taken at previous meetings. So I think the staff does a real rigorous job of going through these and making sure we're consistent. We depend on that. Okay, other questions? Sarah, I've got a question relative to the license proposal, and basically the question is if their license expires prior to 9/1/2015, it's renewed under the current process, right? This is only effective going forward from that. When you go forward from that, I'm assuming that they would be able to count their evaluations, as many as they have, basically, to get to the points that we're talking about. Is that?
That is, all of what you just said is correct, yes.
Okay. Wanted to clarify that. Okay, other questions? Terrence, you've given us a document here from TEA. Would you like to speak to that while we've...
And if possible, I would like to use the time one of my colleagues who came with me, Rick, to kind of talk about that.
Okay. Does everybody have this? You got, okay. Yeah.
Good afternoon. I'll only be a minute because I've set out in pretty great detail what our concerns are about the proposed policy 5.502 that I think the board will be considering on second reading tomorrow. And there's just one narrow part of that causes us some concern, and that is the part of the proposal it's been changed since it was originally presented at your last meeting, but it's set out in Appendix A where evaluation results would be used as a substitute for what would otherwise be required professional development over the life of a teacher's license in order to renew. You've provided for a teacher to have 30 professional development points. As lawyers, we have continuing legal education requirements. Same sort of
that
thing.
hadn't been changed since our last meeting, has it?
Well, it is at your last meeting. It wasn't in the policy. It was in a PowerPoint presentation. But since then, it's been laid out.
It was presented and approved in the last meeting, right?
Last meeting, it was just, it wasn't in your policies that you were considering. It was actually in the PowerPoint, as a deck of slides that was presented.
It was not in the policy document, but now it's in Appendix A of the policy document.
But I think it's correct that it was approved with the understanding that what was in the PowerPoint would be added to. Yeah.
I don't have the answer to that. But my point is that we believe at TEA that there are some legal concerns with the conflating of evaluation and licensure. We've set out the legal concerns. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of legal mumbo jumbo sitting here now, but in short, we believe the legislature has treated licensure and evaluation as separate items, and we believe the legislature has the power to establish education policy, and it has done so by treating those as separate items. And we think that's consistent with the commissioner's own statement to you a year ago in his licensure presentation when he said that licensure and evaluation serve different purposes. They do serve different purposes. And we don't believe incorporating evaluation into the licensure equation is consistent with that. We also think it's bad policy. Every profession that I'm aware of that has license renewals has some sort of continuing education or professional development requirement that goes with it. I have to get 15 hours a year of continuing legal education. It doesn't matter how good a lawyer I am or how good a job somebody else thinks I've done over the last year. I have to do that to keep up with developments in the law and to keep up with developments in how you practice and to keep up to date. We don't see how evaluation serves that purpose. Professional development is what serves that purpose. And so we think both as a matter of law and as a matter of policy, this particular item it should be reconsidered.
Okay, I think it's one of the things that is important to note is that it's completely voluntary, whether you use the evaluation scores or you can do the professional development. I mean, it's not mandatory to go one way or the other.
Well,
it's completely optional.
Yes, sir.
Part of the teacher.
I understand that it's optional, but the board, I mean, the board is about standards and what should be expected of teachers. And I mean, frankly, the fact that I, as a lawyer, may not want to have to do CLE shouldn't matter. I need to be doing it, and the fact that a teacher may want to use an evaluation instead of doing professional development really I don't think should matter to this body. The question is, what ought the teacher be doing in order to have their license renewed? I think that should be what this body should be looking at, not what a particular teacher may want to do.
And of course, I guess one other thing that this board has been very focused on, very interested in, is identifying ways that we can recognize good teaching. And we see that this proposal on the table is one way to accomplish that, to recognize the teachers who are really performing and getting good evaluation scores. Any questions from board members? I wanted to make sure we had a chance to talk about this document. Sarah, any comments?
Thank you. Just to add an additional kind of perspective, I think our feeling in working with the board on this particular part of the proposed policy is just as you said, Chairman, in part that this is a teacher's option to use their scores. And we also think that a teacher that's scoring at expectations or above is demonstrating that they are keeping up to speed with their instructional skills. And so this is an attempt, as you said, to recognize that and to streamline the paperwork requirements. We certainly believe that all teachers should be engaging in meaningful professional development, and we think the majority of our teachers are doing that, and evaluation is part of the process of identifying where teachers can continue to improve. As a matter of fact, at the state level, it's almost impossible to assess the quality of that professional development at the state level as part of the paperwork requirements. And so really what we think this does is to streamline the requirements for teachers who are meeting or exceeding expectations, but does not take away the importance of continuing professional development. It's just that we can't really assess the quality of that, and this is one way of recognizing high-performing teachers and making it a bit easier for them. The other point that I wanted to make just briefly is that there was also a law that passed that allows high-performing teachers to request a waiver from the commissioner that would allow them to bypass any renewal requirements. So we think this is also in keeping with that additional law that required or that allows for renewal requirements to be waived for teachers who are meeting evaluation expectations.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Any other comments, questions? Okay. We appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, one other item that we will try to finalize in our meeting tomorrow is our meetings for next year, the schedule for meetings. And what I'm proposing, and we've checked the calendars on this, and this seems to work, is the same basic schedule that we used the past several years, and that's to have our meetings for 2015 on January the 30th, April the 10th, July the 24th, and October the 23rd. Give you a chance overnight to check calendars to see if there are any real problems with that, but that schedule seems to have worked in past years. January the 30th, April the 10th, July the 24th, and October the 23rd. Those are the Fridays. That would be the board meeting date. We would continue to probably have workshops on the preceding Thursday. Okay, Gary?
Also be looking at your calendars the week of August the 25th, 26th, 27th, and 28th. We'll need to have a call meeting for the priority school list. 25 through 28 of August.
Okay.
It'll be a daytime phone call.
Without barking dogs? No school announcements? Okay. Katie, we certainly appreciate you being with us again. Those who know, Katie is our student member and will be rotating off, but as some of the rest of you recognize, you don't get off this until you get a replacement appointed. So, Katie, we appreciate the extra duty here, and we'll give you some overtime pay for this. Yeah. Great. Thank you.
We also checked, and the parking garage at Sheraton is open. So you may park over there in the morning.
Okay. Any other items? Okay, Scott, when we meet the bus?
Yes, sir. We're going to do 2 shifts. Everybody who's wanted to go back to the Andrew Johnson Tower, we're going to come out in the first shift. So that's probably board staff. And then I'm going to come back up and take everyone who wanted to go back to the hotel on the second shift. And then I'll pick you up at the hotel at 5:15
Okay? Very good. Thank you.